In the summer of 2004, Clara Bennett drove down a narrow country road outside Bellwood, North Carolina, toward a piece of land almost everyone in town had given up on, 50 acres. For years, people had looked at that property and seen nothing but trouble. Clara had paid $8,500 for it. And by the time she parked her truck at the edge of the property, she understood why the previous owners had been so eager to get rid of it. The land didn't look like a farm. It didn't even look like land that could easily be walked across. Kudzu covered nearly everything. The vines crawled along the ground in thick mats, climbed trees, wrapped themselves around fence posts, and formed dense walls that were taller than Clara in some places. Here and there, dead branches poked through the greenery. But beyond that, there was almost nothing to see. No open pasture, no visible road, no buildings, no obvious sign that anyone had ever lived there. Just green, a massive, tangled sea of it. Clara stood there with her hands on her hips, staring at the property she had just spent $8,500 on. Then she laughed. Not because anything was funny. She laughed because she suddenly realized just how crazy the purchase might have been. A neighbor named Walter Grady had already warned her. He had lived in Bellwood most of his life and knew the property's reputation. "Don't let that place fool you," he'd told her. Clara had asked what he meant. Walter pointed toward the hillside. "People have tried." That was all he said, but Clara soon learned what he meant. The first owner had purchased the land years earlier, with plans to turn part of it into pasture. He brought in an excavator. The machine spent several days tearing through the vines. Then the operator hit something buried beneath the vegetation, a large section of old stone. The machine shifted unexpectedly, and the operator had to stop. They moved to another section. There they found more rocks, then an old fence, then a patch of ground so uneven that the machinery couldn't safely operate. The project became more expensive by the day. Eventually, the owner abandoned it. Years later, another man tried. This time, he hired a professional clearing crew. They arrived with tractors, chainsaws, brush cutters, and enough equipment to make the previous attempt look small.
For several weeks, they fought the vegetation. But the deeper they went, the more problems they encountered. The vines were only the surface. Beneath them were rocks, old timber, broken fencing, hidden holes, and steep sections of land that made working with heavy machinery difficult. The crew eventually cleared a small portion. Then they stopped. The cost had become greater than the value of what they thought they were clearing. And that was how the property earned its reputation. A lost cause. By the time Clara bought it, people had stopped asking what could be done with the land. They simply assumed nothing could. But Clara wasn't interested in what people assumed. She was interested in what was actually there. She had grown up around farms. She understood that land could change dramatically when it was neglected. A field could become a forest. A pasture could disappear under weeds. A road could vanish beneath roots and soil. But she also knew something else. Land had a memory. Sometimes, if you were patient enough, it gave pieces of that memory back. So Clara decided she wasn't going to attack the property. At least, not yet. Instead of bringing in another excavator, she tried something that made almost everyone laugh. She bought 12 goats. They arrived on a warm morning in July. 12 animals, 14 acres of fencing, and 50 acres of land that looked like it could swallow all of them. Clara opened the gate. The goats stepped inside. For a few seconds, they simply stood there. Then one walked toward the kudzu. It lowered its head and started eating. Another followed. Then another. Within minutes, all 12 were moving through the vegetation. Clara watched them from the fence. She had no idea whether this would work, but at least the goats weren't complaining. For the first week, almost nothing seemed to change. The kudzu was still everywhere. If anything, Clara wondered whether the goats were simply providing an expensive buffet for themselves. But then, on the 8th morning, she noticed something. A small patch of bare earth. It was only about the size of a dinner plate, but it hadn't been there the day before. Clara crouched down. She brushed away a few remaining vines. Then she noticed something sticking out of the ground. Wood. She pulled at it. The object came loose. It was an old fence post. Clara looked around. Then she found another one, about 20 feet away. Then another. She stood up. There was a line. A very faint line. The fence had collapsed decades ago, but the posts were still there beneath the vegetation. Clara followed them. The line disappeared into the kudzu. She pulled the vines away, and underneath them was something else. A row of stones. Not naturally scattered rocks. These had been placed together. A wall. Clara ran her hand across the rough stones. She couldn't explain why, but she suddenly felt like she was standing on something important. She began clearing around it. Over the next few weeks, the goats uncovered more clues. An old metal hinge, a rusted farm tool, fragments of wooden boards, a piece of wire fencing. And then, one afternoon, Clara found something that stopped her completely. A small piece of broken glass. It looked like part of an old bottle. She held it up to the sunlight. It was thick, dark, and covered in dirt. Someone had been here. Not recently, not even within her lifetime, but someone had lived here, worked here, built things here, and planted something here. Clara just didn't know what. Then the goats began acting strangely. It happened so gradually that she almost ignored it. The goats were grazing across the property one morning when they reached a particular section of the hillside. One by one, they stopped. Clara watched. The animals had been eating everything in front of them, but now they stood shoulder to shoulder, staring at a thick wall of kudzu. None of them went through. Clara called to them. Come on. Nothing. She walked toward them. The goats moved aside. Clara stepped through the vines herself. There was nothing obvious. No fence. No ditch. No fallen tree. Just more kudzu. She turned around. The goats were still standing on the other side. Clara shrugged. Maybe they simply didn't like that particular patch. She went back to work. The next morning, it happened again. Same place. Same wall of vegetation. Same refusal. Clara started paying attention. The third morning, she stood there for several minutes watching them. 12 goats. 3 mornings. The exact same boundary. And suddenly, Clara had a strange feeling. Maybe the goats weren't refusing to cross it for no reason. Maybe there was something beneath those vines. Something they could sense that she couldn't see. She stepped closer. The kudzu was unusually thick there. Much thicker than the vegetation around it. Clara grabbed a handful. She pulled. Nothing. She pulled again. The vines stretched, but didn't break. She planted one foot against the ground and pulled with both hands. Then, rip, the vines suddenly tore free. Clara stumbled backward. She caught herself and looked through the opening. At first, she couldn't understand what she was seeing. There was a massive tree trunk directly in front of her. Not a young tree, not a wild sapling. A huge, weathered trunk. And it was alive. Clara slowly stepped forward. She placed one hand against the bark. Then she looked up. The branches disappeared into the green canopy above her. She pulled away another section of kudzu. And that's when she noticed something that made her heart begin to race. 30 feet away stood another tree. And beyond that, another, and another, all in a straight line. Clara stepped back. She looked from one tree to the next. Then she turned toward the goats. The animals were still standing behind her. And for the first time, Clara realized she might not have just found an old tree. She might have found something much bigger. Something that had been hidden beneath the vines for decades. Clara spent the next several minutes walking between the trees. The farther she went, the harder it became to convince herself that this was an accident. The trees were spaced almost perfectly. One row ran east to west. Another ran parallel to it. Then another. And another. She stood in the middle of the vegetation, turning slowly as she tried to take it all in. There were trees everywhere. Not dozens scattered randomly across the hillside. Rows of them. An orchard. A forgotten orchard buried beneath years of kudzu. Clara had no idea how long she stood there. Eventually, she pulled out her phone and started taking pictures. Then she called Walter Grady. Walter, she said, you remember that land you told me about? There was a pause. Unfortunately, I think I found something. What? I think there's an orchard here. Walter laughed. Not because he thought she was joking. Because he genuinely didn't believe her. An orchard? Yes. Clara, I've lived beside that property for 40 years. I know. I've never seen an orchard there. Neither had I. There was another silence. Then Walter said something that stayed with her. Well, maybe you should find out what you're looking at. That was exactly what Clara intended to do. Over the following days, she began clearing small areas around the trees. She worked carefully. She didn't want to cut anything until she knew what she was dealing with. The goats continued doing most of the work. They moved through the lower sections of the property, clearing vines and exposing more ground. And every time Clara thought she had reached the edge of the orchard, she found another row. Then another. The orchard was much larger than she'd first imagined. Eventually, she counted nearly 60 mature trees. Some were so old that their branches twisted into strange shapes. Others had suffered damage from storms. A few were dead, but many were alive, and some were producing fruit. The first apple Clara found was small and slightly misshapen. It didn't look like the polished apples she was used to seeing in grocery stores. But when she cut it open, the flesh was firm. She took a bite. It was sweet, then slightly tart, and completely unlike the apples she normally bought. She found pears next, then plums. She even discovered a few trees she couldn't immediately identify. Clara became obsessed. She wanted to know how long the orchard had been there. So she started looking through the county records. The first thing she discovered was that the property had once been much more than 50 acres. Decades earlier, it had belonged to a farming family named the Whitmores. Thomas Whitmore and his wife, Eleanor, had lived there with their children. The family had farmed the land for generations. And according to an old agricultural report from the 1930s, the Whitmore farm had once been known for its fruit. Clara found an old newspaper clipping. The paper was yellow and brittle. The photograph was faded. But there it was. A farmhouse, a barn, and behind them, rows of trees. Clara stared at the picture. Then she looked through the window at the hillside outside. The landscape had changed almost beyond recognition. But the rows were unmistakable. It was the same orchard. She took the photograph to Walter. He stared at it for a long time. Then he shook his head. I've never seen this. Do you remember the Whitmores? My father used to mention them. Did he ever talk about the orchard? Walter frowned. Not that I remember. And that was the strange part. Somehow, an entire orchard had disappeared from local memory. Not physically. It was still there. The trees were still growing. But nobody seemed to know. Clara wanted answers. So she contacted an agricultural historian named Dr. Samuel Reed. He agreed to visit the property. When he arrived, Clara took him directly to the orchard. Dr. Reed didn't speak at first. He walked slowly between the trees. He touched the bark. He examined the leaves. He looked at the fruit. Every few minutes, he stopped and wrote something in a notebook. Clara followed him. Finally, she asked, "So, what do you think?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward one of the largest apple trees. He looked at the fruit hanging from its branches. Then he looked back at Clara. "Where did you get this variety?" Clara pointed at the tree. "It's been here." Dr. Reed smiled slightly. "That's not what I mean." He explained that the tree appeared to be an old regional variety, one that wasn't commonly grown commercially anymore. Clara asked why. Dr. Reed told her that commercial agriculture had gradually narrowed the number of fruit varieties farmers planted. Large growers wanted fruit that looked uniform, fruit that traveled well, fruit that could be harvested and stored efficiently. Older varieties were often pushed aside. Some disappeared completely, but these trees had survived. And that wasn't all. Dr. Reed examined several more trees. Then his expression changed. He started moving faster. He went from tree to tree, taking photographs, writing notes, checking fruit. Finally, he turned toward Clara. "You may have something very unusual here." "How unusual?" "Potentially significant." Clara looked around. "What does that mean?" "It means this isn't just an old orchard." He pointed toward the rows. "These trees may represent varieties that are extremely difficult to find today." Clara looked at the trees again. For years, she'd seen them as overgrown vegetation. Now she was looking at living pieces of agricultural history. Dr. Reed explained that some heirloom varieties had survived in remote family orchards long after commercial growers stopped planting them. They were passed from generation to generation through cuttings and seeds. But once a farm was abandoned, many of those varieties disappeared. This orchard was different. The trees had been abandoned, but they hadn't disappeared. They had simply been covered. And strangely enough, the kudzu may have helped preserve them. Not because the vines were beneficial. They weren't. The kudzu had smothered the landscape and damaged many of the trees. But it had also hidden the orchard from people. No one came through and cut the trees down. No developer saw the land and decided to clear it. No farmer replaced the old trees with newer varieties. The orchard was forgotten. And because it was forgotten, it survived. Clara stood quietly beneath one of the oldest trees. Then she noticed something else. The trunk was enormous. Its bark was deeply ridged. And near the base, partly covered by soil, was a small metal tag. She crouched down. She carefully brushed away the dirt. There were numbers stamped into it, and beneath the numbers was a name. Clara couldn't read all of it, but the first word was clear. Whitmore. She stared at the tag. This wasn't just an abandoned orchard. Someone had deliberately cataloged these trees. Someone had cared enough about them to identify them. And that raised an entirely new question. Who had planted them? And why had the family abandoned a farm that seemed to have been so important to them? Clara returned to the county records. This time, she went back much farther. And what she found about the Whitmore family changed the story completely. The first record Clara found was from 1948. It was a property transfer. Thomas Whitmore was listed as the owner. But a few years later, the records changed. The farm had been sold. Clara kept digging. She found a newspaper article from 1951 mentioning a serious illness in the Whitmore family. Then another article. Then a notice about the sale of the property. The pieces slowly came together. Thomas Whitmore had become seriously ill. The family had struggled financially. The farm was eventually sold, and the Whitmores moved away. But the new owners didn't maintain the orchard. They focused on the lower fields. The farmhouse was eventually abandoned. The fences collapsed. The property changed hands several more times. And then the kudzu arrived. It spread across the lower pasture first, then climbed the hillside. Year after year, it swallowed more of the farm. Eventually, the farmhouse disappeared beneath vegetation. The orchard disappeared too, but the trees remained. Clara sat at her kitchen table that evening, surrounded by old photographs, property records, and notes. She kept looking at the photograph from the 1930s. The Whitmore family stood in front of their farmhouse. Behind them were the same trees Clara had just discovered. She wondered what it must have been like when the orchard was still alive with activity. People harvesting apples, children running between the rows, wooden crates being loaded onto wagons, neighbors stopping by to buy fruit. It had once been someone's entire world. Now, almost nobody remembered it. The next morning, Clara returned to the property. She walked past the goats and climbed toward the orchard. This time, she noticed something she'd missed before. The old stone wall didn't end at the orchard. It continued uphill. Clara followed it. The wall disappeared beneath the vines, then reappeared several yards later. She cleared another section, then another. Eventually, the stones formed the outline of a small structure. Clara's heart began beating faster. She dug carefully with a hand shovel. A few inches beneath the soil, she found a flat stone. Underneath it was a rusted metal object. She pulled it free. It was a small farm tool. Beside it was a piece of wood that had almost completely rotted away. Clara kept digging. Then she uncovered something unexpected. A metal box. It was badly rusted. The lid was stuck. She took it home. It took her nearly an hour to pry it open. Inside were several pieces of paper protected by a layer of waxed cloth. Most were damaged. Some were unreadable. But one page was still surprisingly clear. It was a handwritten list. Names, dates, and beneath them, several varieties of fruit trees. Clara stared at the page. The Whitmores hadn't simply planted an orchard. They had been preserving specific varieties. Some of the names matched trees Dr. Reed had already identified. And one note at the bottom caught Clara's attention. It mentioned a nearby county agricultural fair. The date was 1937. Apparently, the Whitmore family had entered several of their fruits into a competition. One of them had won first prize. Clara couldn't help smiling. She imagined someone from the family carrying those apples into town nearly 70 years earlier. Proud of what they had grown. Proud of the land. Proud of something they believed would continue long after they were gone. But they couldn't have known what would happen. The farm would disappear. The family would leave. The buildings would collapse. The orchard would vanish beneath Kudzu. And eventually, almost everyone would forget it had ever existed. Except the trees. They remembered. Not consciously, of course, but in their roots, in their branches, in the fruit they continued producing year after year. Clara gave copies of the documents to Dr. Reed. He was fascinated. He told her that the information could help identify some of the varieties more accurately. But he also warned her not to rush. If she wanted to preserve the orchard, she needed to protect the oldest trees. So Clara changed her plans. She stopped thinking about clearing the entire 50 acres. Instead, she focused on the orchard. She cleared paths, repaired sections of the stone wall, removed invasive vines carefully, marked each surviving tree. And over time, the property began changing. People noticed. Neighbors who had once laughed at her goats started visiting. Walter Grady came by one afternoon and stood at the edge of the orchard. He looked around. Then he shook his head. "I've lived here my whole life," he said. Clara smiled. "And you never knew this was here?" "No." He looked at the trees. "That's the strangest part." But the strangest part wasn't that Walter hadn't known. It was that nobody had known. The land had been sitting there for decades. The evidence was beneath their feet. They just hadn't looked closely enough. Then came the first real harvest. It wasn't enormous. Clara wasn't expecting it to be. But there were enough apples, pears, and plums to fill several baskets. She placed them on a wooden table outside the farmhouse she had built on the property. Dr. Reed examined them. Then he tasted one. He smiled. "This is exactly why old varieties matter." Clara looked at the fruit. They weren't perfect. Some were small. Some had blemishes. Some looked nothing like the fruit in supermarkets. But they had survived. And somehow, that made them beautiful. Clara eventually began propagating the healthiest trees. She planted new saplings. She shared cuttings with agricultural researchers. She documented the orchard. And she kept the original trees protected. Years after the discovery, the property no longer looked like the green graveyard. The kudzu was under control. The old stone wall was visible again. The orchard stood open to the sky, and the rows of trees could be seen from the road. But Clara never forgot how the discovery began. Not with a tractor, not with an excavator, not with some expensive piece of machinery. It began with 12 goats, and 3 mornings when those goats refused to cross a wall of vines. One evening, Clara stood at the edge of the orchard watching the animals graze. She thought about everything the land had survived. The abandoned farmhouse, the forgotten family, the collapsed fences, the years of neglect, the kudzu, the failed clearing attempts, and finally, her own arrival. She had bought 50 acres because everyone else thought it was worthless. But the land had never been worthless. It had simply become invisible. And perhaps that's what makes the story of Clara Bennett's orchard so remarkable. Sometimes, we look at an overgrown field and see a problem. We look at an old building and see ruins. We look at neglected land and assume there is nothing left. But beneath the weeds, beneath the vines, beneath years of neglect, there may still be something waiting. A memory, a piece of history, a living thing that refused to disappear. Clara thought she was buying 50 acres of useless land. Instead, she uncovered a piece of the past that nobody even knew they had lost. And all it took to find it was 12 hungry goats.